Okay, that looks like we've got close to our final number. There's been nearly 1,000 of you who have signed up for this webinar, which is great to see, such a demand for the session. Big thanks to AWS, who have been the partner for this webinar and really helpful in putting everything together and bringing this excellent group of panelists into the debate. Now, before I hand over to our moderator for the day, Todd Neuville, I just want to do one quick thing, and that's if you could all just write hi in the questions box, which you should be able to see in your toolbar. I just want to make sure that you can all see it and that you're ready to answer and ask questions throughout the discussion. As of course, this is an interactive session and we do want your questions coming in thick and fast, and we'll get to them at certain points throughout the discussion. But without further ado, I'm going to swap over to Todd, who you will be able to now see, and he's going to do a quick introduction of himself and hand over to the rest of the panelists as well. Good luck, everyone, and thanks for joining.
Sure, thank you, James, and welcome everyone. And we are truly excited today to have this panel discussion. We're very fortunate to be joined by a number of individuals that bring unique perspectives from the field. And we've got some straightforward objectives that we'd like to accomplish today. Number one, we want to focus on patient engagement in clinical trials. Why it's important, why does it matter? What are we doing about it from an industry stakeholder perspective, from a patient advocacy standpoint, as well as through the application of technology. Number two, what are some of the steps being taken to mitigate some of the challenges that have been in place, but also some of the opportunities that exist? And finally, we all realize that we're in the state of a pandemic. And what does that post-pandemic or during the pandemic exercise look like? So again, welcome. We're really looking forward to having this conversation. As James mentioned, my name is Todd Neuville. I'm the worldwide leader for life sciences at AWS. I've been associated with the industry for 31 years, and I'm very passionate about this space, and you'll see and hear that from all of these panelists as well. So why don't we do a quick round of introductions, and I'll do left to right in terms of what I see. Sonali, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Sure, thanks, Todd, and it's great to be here with you all this morning. My name is Sonali Duggal. I'm the head of business development for a healthcare technology company called Pareto. We focus on patient recruitment, especially in underrepresented communities that are part of community health centers. Yeah.
Perfect. Cindy.
Hi, everyone. My name is Cynthia Chmielewski, and I'm here to present the patient point of view. I'm an myeloma patient diagnosed in 2008, and now I'm involved in a lot of organizations in the area of research advocacy.
Great. Craig.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Todd. It's great to be here. My name is Craig Lipset. I'm an independent advisor working with organizations seeking to bring new approaches for how they develop their medicines. I was previously the head of clinical innovation at Pfizer, and I serve on the faculty at Rutgers University in health informatics, as well as the University of Rochester in the Center for Health and Technology.
Great, thanks, Craig. And last but not least, Madeline.
Hi, everyone. Madeline Geday. I'm the Director of Global Patient Engagement and Innovation for MSD. So within my job role, it's really critical that the voice of the patient is really incorporated into mostly everything that we do. And I also help co-lead an initiative to bring and ensure that our trials are diverse in our patient populations for our clinical trials being enrolled in our global development programs.
Sure. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Madeline. Madeline, I actually wanted to start off with you, if I could, and pose a question around the industry perspective related to patient engagement. And really two focal points. Number one, why is it important? Why does it matter? And are there any observations either from your organization or others within the industry that you think have moved the needle with respect to patient engagement?
Sure, thanks. So, historically, patient engagement and patient involvement has really been vital in the design and execution of our clinical trials. And recently, I think with COVID, it's become even more prevalent and prominent to make sure that we're engaging our patients from the very inception of our clinical trials, but also our operational aspects of clinical trial design. Patients, especially with technology today, also understand more than they ever have. And we should be, as an industry, really trying to give our patients more. But there's a lot of things that really could be gleaned from the sponsor perspective in terms of what can be gained from patient engagement, and I would say a really ideal patient engagement strategy. And we know that some of the things that can be gained are, patient engagement really is instrumental to having better patient experiences that lead to increased trial participation, which we know. Patients are also more likely to adhere to the protocol and trial design if they're more engaged. There's going to be a reduction in dropout rates, which can in turn speed up the delivery of medicines to market. We also know that patient feedback is really important for us as an industry to make sure that we're incorporating the voice of the patient in future trials as well. And I would say some strong relationships also with our patient and advocacy groups can result in access to those insights for various steps of product development. And I would say in light of COVID, that's been one of the main things that we've been trying to do is listen to patients and patient advocacy groups when we're thinking about diversity in our clinical trials and also the implications of incorporating a diverse patient population into our trials. And then, we know that patient insights also allow, for there to be more innovations brought to the clinical trial design process. And again, with those community advocates, I think it's really important that we create materials and trusted voices that can communicate the information about clinical trials in today's COVID era. And so I'll stop there to see if any of my colleagues have any input. But I would say that there's a lot of resources out there in terms of, what we can do to make patient engagement easier and less burdensome to our patients and our caregivers. And I think really keeping the patient's voice in mind when we're designing our trials, and especially those operational aspects of clinical trial design, are really essential and really important.
Yeah.
Excellent, thank you.
I agree. From a patient, I agree. I really, think that the patient voice needs to be there throughout the process from the beginning. Not even preclinical. Patients should be there, maybe in support groups and focus groups, helping define what questions they want asked. Sometimes what is being asked is not what they want to know. They may want to know different things. So have it preclinical. And also, I'm a firm believer in co-creation. I think, you can co-create your protocol, have patients of diverse backgrounds be in there, have patient advocates who understand the science there, presenting the entire patient perspective, but also have other groups of patients in there looking at your protocol. And I agree, you need to poll the patients as they're part of that clinical trial process, see what's going wrong, see what's going right, what do they like, if they would change anything, what can they change, and what you've already said, pair with leaders in those communities with trusted voices to help share, educate on what the trials are, what the results are. Educational materials can be co-created. So I think, what you really need to do is ask yourself in your job, have I talked to a patient about this? How many patients have I talked about this? Was it diverse even before you move on with any initiative that you have?
And I also think all the great things that have been happening, today with COVID, as far as from an educational perspective, there's a lot of things out there already that we don't need to recreate the wheel. And there's been a lot of various stakeholders that have been engaged in trying to create materials that are, straightforward and trusted sources of information. So there's a lot of stuff out there as far as misinformation and disinformation. And I know, just to give the audience some takeaways, MRCT and also SysScript are two, I would say, really trusted organizations that have developed a lot of patient materials, that are not, I would say, it's it's going to be more straightforward and I think more trusted. So definitely, if you haven't checked those out, please do, especially in terms of the information for patients around COVID.
Thank you.
Todd, I think one word that I heard from Madeline and Cynthia that I just want to emphasize and double click on for people is diversity. And now more than ever, the appreciation that if you're going to engage with patients for input, and you should be engaging with patients for input, to ensure that you have the patients representative of those that you aspire to enroll in your studies. If your input process is lacking diversity, you shouldn't be surprised when your enrollment and downstream participation looks the same.
Right. Thanks, Craig. Sonali, Pareto does some very interesting work that really captures the essence of incorporating the point of care, that relationship that already exists, and then providing a mechanism for the underserved population to become aware of trials and actually enroll and participate in trials. Could you comment briefly in terms of some of the work that has been done, which has increased inclusion and diversity? Because I think it's quite interesting. It's a different approach. Oops, Sonali, I think you're on mute. I'm sorry.
Sorry about that. How's now?
Perfect,
All
thank
right.
you.
I think it speaks to a lot of what the other panelists have mentioned in terms of incorporating diverse patients in clinical trials. So what we do is connect patients from community health centers nationwide to clinical trials that fit their needs. And one thing that we've heard, especially in this era of COVID, is an especially strong eagerness and appetite for community health centers to be included in clinical research. I think in the past, there's been kind of an understandable suspicion of clinical research for a variety of reasons. But given the importance of having diverse participation, particularly with regards to COVID vaccine trials, COVID therapeutic trials, given how the population, especially of Black and Hispanic patients, have been disproportionately affected by that disease, we've seen a lot of interest in having community health centers help to inform their patients of these trials. And we're hoping that translates to maybe more of an awareness of the need for diversity in clinical trials more broadly, which has obviously been a need for a very long time. But given the national racial reckoning that's taken place, there's been a real sharpening we've seen around that need and around solutions to that, both from the biopharma side as well as from the community health center side.
Great, thank you. Craig, I was interested, you have done a lot of work historically and for a long period of time around the concept of decentralized trials. If you look at that history, why do you think they haven't been adopted as broadly as one would think at this point? And is it truly just the pandemic creating an inflection point that is putting organizations and sponsors in a position where they want to accelerate that change? We'd be interested in your longer term perspective.
Todd, you're absolutely right. Decentralized trials aren't necessarily a new idea. The ability to shift the location so that patients can participate in more convenient and accessible places has actually been around for a good 17 years. And in the last 6 years, most major pharma companies have been investing and experimenting in this area, but really with only incremental adoption. As recently as January of this year, I was sharing at different meetings that our supply of solutions in that space significantly outpaced the demand. And then COVID struck, and the solutions that were needed for trial continuity were to adopt things that already existed. Drug developers didn't have to create new solutions. They simply had to look at risk-based monitoring, data-driven, centralized monitoring, and the decentralized tools that have been available, but where adoption was really incremental at best. Your point is truly valid, though. Will the adoption sustain and continue after the pandemic? Because in truth, organizations did not embrace decentralized research because they suddenly felt inspired to be innovators. They were as risk averse as ever. And in the environment that we were presented with starting in March, the risk benefit equation shifted. Suddenly, the solutions that 3 months earlier were viewed as too risky to introduce at scale were the risk mitigation strategy. But what we're starting to see is in the spring, so many pharma companies were scrambling to introduce these approaches. And now in the summer and into the fall, we're seeing many that are committing to these approaches. And we know what commitment involves in our industry. Relooking at our SOPs and our training, relooking at our protocol designs, relooking at our vendors and partners. We're seeing organizations that are making those commitments, which certainly gives hope that these approaches will carry on and sustain, because they were risk mitigation in 2020, but hopefully there are countermeasures for improving access, improving convenience, and potentially improving diversity and representation in our trials. You know, one data point, Todd, I want to throw out to the audience. When the pandemic first struck, I think many of us wondered which way patient sentiment may swing around research participation. Will people suddenly become more aware that research exists and clinical trials exist and want to be in, or will they fear clinical research and swing the other direction? Back in April, we were seeing surveys from groups like Subject Well and Continuum Clinical that started to suggest maybe interest is going on the upswing, and maybe we'll see that that wind that will lift participation in trials. Unfortunately, as recently as July and August, we've seen data that suggests exactly the opposite. Madeline mentioned organizations like CISCRP, the Center for the Information on the Study of Clinical Research Participation. CISCRP does an annual survey, which is highly trusted, surveying some 8,000 plus patients in the US and around the world. Unfortunately, patient interest in clinical research participation has plummeted this summer. Now, it could be because of fear. It could be because of fear of going out to research sites in this environment, because we've also seen studies from groups like Subject Well that have indicated that some 60% of patients would be more likely to participate if studies used telehealth solutions, decentralized approaches. And interestingly, that type of survey result has persisted across geographic boundaries. As far as Japan, we saw similar data coming back. 60% of research participants said that they would prefer alternatives to site visits. And so while we're seeing this really dangerous drop, this plummet in terms of interest in research participation, now more than ever, we need to commit to these types of countermeasures.
Great, very valid points, Craig. To be constructive here, I always hesitate to bring up the word blocker or challenge because I think there are a number of them in terms of any type of broad scale change that takes place. But perhaps we could go around the panel, and if you could identify something that you think is getting in the way, and then also tag on how that might be mitigated. What's an opportunity to actually de-risk that blocker, that challenge, and really turn it into an opportunity? I didn't know if somebody wanted to kick off that particular topic. Cindy, I see you smiling. Did you want to go first?
Learn not to smile. That that is my takeaway today. Okay. I guess we're talking about blockers to enrollment in trials. Is that what you're talking?
Right. And I think when we were our initial discussion, there was an interesting topic that you brought up around the importance of being involved at the beginning, even something as simple as signing up and enrolling in a trial and signing the patient consent form and what the experience has been like, even at stage one. I thought you had some interesting perspectives there.
Yeah, well, I guess if you want to talk a little bit about the informed consent form, I could talk a little about that. I review lots of them because I'm on an IRB at the University of Pennsylvania, and it is my job to read the informed consent form through the patient's eyes to see if it makes sense. But it's too late by the time it gets to the IRB, unless there's something completely wrong with it. It goes through. I can make suggestions for making it more readable, or include a graph here, or do a link here, or make it staged so the important information's up front. But if it's not harming the patients, then those suggestions don't need to be followed. So I think, that informed consent form needs to be designed much earlier in the process, with patients in mind, with patients reading them, with checking their understandability, and then just signing the consent. I'm loving the idea that now during COVID, those consent forms can be signed at home. You could have that informed consent discussion with your healthcare team, telemedicine, understanding it, but then taking the time to read it at home, where you may, if you don't understand something, Google it and get a video on what does it mean to have a PET CT scan, or what does this mean, so that you have more time. Because when you are in that doctor's office and they give you this informed document, that the minimum amount of pages I've seen is 20. They've gone on to 30, 40 pages because there's special signatures for specimen collections and for genomic testing and for this and that. You just get overwhelmed, and you either sign it because you want to be part of the trial without reading and understanding what you're signing, or you say, forget it. There's just too much here. Look at all these possible consequences, So if you have the opportunity to look at it digitally at home, in the comfort of your home, where you could discuss it maybe with your family members and then go back to your team, that may be something that would be advantageous to that whole clinical trial process.
Great. Thank you. Before others chime in, James, I was wondering if you might be able to load the first survey question, and folks can complete that or respond to that, and we can continue the dialogue. Others on the panel, comments around a challenge, a blocker, something that's getting in the way that participants in this particular session could go back to their organizations and actually look to implement a change that could mitigate that particular blocker.
Yeah, I'll chime in here. So we work with a lot of organizations who have patients that are uninsured or underinsured. And one of the blockers that they continue to identify is that, if a patient were to actually enroll in a clinical trial, and let's say there were any kind of a complication or an adverse event with the clinical trial, it's not necessarily part of that trial that they could then receive care. So a solution that's been identified, again, by many of our community health center partners is ensuring that that aspect is really clear for uninsured and underinsured patients, that, should they have any issues, that's going to be covered as part of the overall protocol for the trial.
Great, thank you.
Todd, I'm happy to contribute here. I'd say that a blocker here is the perception that well, I speak a fair amount with organizations to have empathy for study teams inside of development organizations. And it sounds a little strange. I've gone out and talked to patient groups and cancer survivors to have empathy for the study team. But in truth, the study teams that are trying to execute here are busy. And they have a lot of different commitments, and the budget is constrained. Even though people look at large pharma and say vast unlimited resources, study budgets are constrained. It is a finite pie. And so, for many of those organizations, implementing these new approaches is just being thrown on top of people that are already working around the clock in order to deliver and execute. And my call would be that if we truly are committed as organizations in these areas, we have to resource it and give these people the capacity, the support internally in order to actually deliver in these areas. Because if it's just an extra night job for people, the only teams that will be able to take this on are the fringe teams that are particularly motivated to become innovators and first-time, leaders in different areas. But if we want these new approaches, whether it's listening and engaging with patients straight through to incorporating new types of digital solutions to improve access, we need to give our teams the capacity and the space to do this. And it might mean some extra spend, and hopefully that's an investment that organizations will be able to recover.
And just to also chime in here from the sponsor perspective, just to echo what Craig was saying, the amount of I would say, support that is needed, and how internal development of an initiative and the importance of having a clearly defined strategy with the resources is really important. So whether we're talking about a digital strategy and how to incorporate that, at a sponsor level, and having the various support, senior leadership support of that with budgetary and resources, but also a clearly defined, if we're gonna, really talk about patient engagement and also, diverse enrollment as part of that patient engagement strategy, there really needs to be a clearly defined strategy and clearly defined roles and responsibilities, and also support. And then, without that, it's really hard to move things forward, just because, like Craig was saying, it's, these one-off teams, and then the initiative, might be a special project or something like that, but then it doesn't really go anywhere. And so for there to be really true change, patient engagement, clinical trial diversity really needs to be integrated into the DNA of how we work within our organizations.
Great. Those are really great segues into the results of the poll question that we just asked. And to give a summary, we have 68% of respondents indicated that they definitely have a strategy in place for change over the next several years. And otherwise, we are currently developing our strategy. And then you have 20% that indicated we have a lot of work to do. What's interesting is the development of a strategy, and as we do a lot of work with life science companies, CROs, academic medical centers, other types of sponsors, transformational exercises are very difficult. One of the relatively more straightforward steps is to identify what your strategy will look like. And one of the things to think about is looking at the continuum of high value opportunities that are relatively straightforward in terms of influencing or changing, and starting there. And I really believe in transformation. Momentum begets momentum. Otherwise, transformations are big and they can be daunting, and it can be a struggle in terms of identifying where do we start. And at some points we almost think too big. It's great to think big from a strategic standpoint, but what are those iterative steps in terms of getting there? Okay. Any comments related to how do you propel the organization forward? Craig and Madeline, you had identified some of those internal barriers that may exist, but what about that concept, Craig, you had mentioned around de-risking, and we do a panel around what we call a digital engagement forum, and that change process and de-risking the process comes up quite a bit. What does that actually mean, and how might individuals, again, go back to their organizations and help the organization de-risk those processes related to change?
I think that we sometimes get lost in two areas in development organizations. I think we sometimes get lost because we see exciting things being presented in the environment and assume that that's what we're supposed to be lifting and dropping into our organizations. And sometimes we get overwhelmed because we're trying to fit everything into our studies. And I think when I spend time with different development leaders today, I encourage them to take more incremental approaches in terms of driving adoption. You don't have to put everything initially into every study, but let's be thoughtful. And when the real secret sauce here, Todd, the real challenge for most organizations isn't whose development org can go out and find the most awesome new tech. We're all looking at the same things, right? There's a toolkit that's emerging that everybody is looking at. And the magic here, the winners here, are who is able to look at their portfolio, the different needs based on the indications they're looking at, talk to the patients in the disease areas that are important to them, understand the geographies and their own culture, and do the matching exercise to be able to pair the right new tool for the right study based on the needs for that trial, based on the patient input they're getting, based on the geographies that they're rolling out to, and understanding the internal constraints around their own culture. That's what's going to set apart the winners and the losers here. We shouldn't get lost in trying to continue to search for that new pearl. We should focus our energy on execution and making sure that we can put these up in our studies, we can generate evidence of their impact, and we can drive scale. And by scale, take that e-consent example that Cynthia was sharing earlier. E-consent has been around. This isn't a new idea. We're seeing that adoption, like you were mentioning earlier, during COVID, but we don't really see organizations that have yet been able to commit at scale across their enterprise. That to me is the exciting part. That to me is the piece, the type of piece that we say, okay, it feels incremental, but when we're able to figure out how to drive that across our enterprise, now it's a significant shift in how we're running our studies. And we take that piece by piece and we can make a monumental shift, driving improved experience for all.
Great.
From the patient.
Madeline, did you have a... No,
Oh, go ahead,
I'm sorry. Nope, I was just going to ask if you had a comment related to that from an industry perspective.
Yeah, I would say, just to Craig's point, don't try to boil the ocean. I think a lot of us, look at digital technology, and it's a very daunting, view of how to implement, something as monstrous as, a digital strategy versus taking, looking at the benefit impact analysis of a different technique or a specific type of digital technology that is trying to meet a business need or for an indication. As Craig mentioned too, when we're looking at like indications related to oncology versus non-oncology, things are very different. The technologies are going to be different. Even the way that patients may want to receive their care is different and need to receive their care. And I think building flexibility into, the types of, operational aspects relating to digital technology. Also, building in that flexibility. Can certain visits be telehealth or, a remote-based visit, and can other visits be in the office, or they need to happen in the office? I think is also going to be a way to help guide teams to be able to, have an implementation strategy. And I'd also say, like, another hurdle that we come up against is when we're thinking about various technologies. For us, we do have to run things and get the approval of legal, privacy, compliance, and all the necessary, people to kind of approve the strategy as well. And I think sometimes, it is, since it's such a large area and there's so much unknown about some of the digital technologies in the space, it's a lot easier to just have a blanket no to everything, that it's too complicated, we don't have time, we need it now, why even bother? So I think we need to also define a way to yes. So not just kind of accepting the no, but what is the path forward, and what is a way to yes?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we think a lot about the technology in the recruitment part of it, which is like the part of the clinical trial that we work on. And it's been interesting because in our experience, the thing that has been most effective for recruitment is that relationship of trust between a provider and a patient, in our case, the primary care provider and the patient. And there's absolutely nothing technological about that. But are there ways that we can use technology to scale that relationship of trust, which is, so very human and so key to actually getting patients engaged and interested in the clinical trial? So we think about it more in terms of, are there ways that technology can be used to improve workflows and therefore improve diversity in that way? Less so kind of this, shiny thing that's going to solve every problem or be a panacea, but more, we think there are very specific ways that technology can be used to scale that relationship of trust and make it more repeatable.
And that's a really good point, Sonali, because sometimes I think before we embark on a big strategy, we should be talking with our stakeholders, such as our patients and also our sites. And that's the one thing that we really, sometimes I think it's been we're in a very patient-centric and patient-focused era in clinical development. But I would say also the stakeholder that sometimes gets looked over, we kind of breeze by them and kind of check the box, is what are our sites saying? And are we creating more burden on our sites to utilize all these various technologies? If we have, if a site is working with 15 different sponsors and every sponsor has a different technology, what does that look like for the site? And so I would just also, caution that when we're doing this, we really have to think about the rollout plan, the training plan for our sites. And like you're saying too, Sonali, one of the, a couple of things that patients say and what we hear is that, and Cindy, I'm sure you can contribute to this, is, they want to be thanked for their participation. They want transparency into what's happening. I know a lot of patients also want consistency in who they're being seen by. And I think those are all little things that we could do and it really impart to our sites that would make participation, better. And I know that some of our trials too, we have, our sites have staff that just calls the patient just to check in to say, hey, how's it going? Is there, what's going on in your life? What's going on in your day to day? How's your dog doing? I heard they were sick. So I think there's a lot of different ways that we can do to create that touch point for the patient that will enhance recruitment and retention in a natural relationship way between our patients and our sites.
Todd, in my last organization, we had these different work streams, and I'm sure every large pharma has it like this. And we had a work stream focused on patient experience, and we had one focused on site experience. And we wound up merging those two together. And at first I thought, this is a mistake. How can we possibly we're going to wind up losing our focus on the patient by blending the two. But blending the two made perfect sense. And Madeline's point is spot on. You cannot separate the patient experience from the experience that we're giving to our investigators and the study coordinators. They are the front line. We can get excited about apps and digital tools, but we should think about our own lives and our own journeys. When you go to the airport and you're traveling, United might give you, or Delta might give you, a great app, and that's a nice add-on, but that's not what's going to dictate your experience. It's going to be driven by all of those different stakeholders. And similar to our work inside of pharma, those airlines can't control every TSA agent, every baggage handler. It's not their employees. Those are other partners with whom they have to work to help make sure that their customers' experience end-to-end is optimized. Now, look, I'm not saying airlines nail it every time, and I don't want to see patients dragged out of a clinical trial, but that thought process that Madeline is describing is spot on. Your patient experience begins with their interaction with the site. And if we're not emphasizing that and giving them the tools, resources, support, and capacity, all of our patient experience interventions are destined to be trivial.
Thanks, Craig. Cindy, from a patient, the question, and it's been answered from a couple of different perspectives, which is exceptional. What does that feel like? What does successful engagement feel like? I think we can often focus a lot on the process steps of, let's do this, let's do that, let's do this. But ultimately, what does that feel like, a successful patient engagement process?
I guess it feels like you're including me, but you're knowing me. And you're valuing me. You're treating me like a guest in your house, So if I'm enrolled in your trial, when I come in, maybe I have like an easy pass. I don't have to wait into that waiting room with all the other people because I'm special. I'm a research participant. I don't wait with you. I go to my special room with my special chair, or and I also wear the oncology hat, so it's kind of hard for me to talk there. But you know me, and I have a special number in case I have any questions. I could call that special number, and I talk to the same person over and over again. I don't have 20 numbers to call to 20 different people, and every time I call, I talk to somebody else. I have a one point of contact where any of my concerns come from, and yeah, and I know what the value is. If I'm participating in the trial, if you're presenting research results at a meeting, give me them in patient-friendly language after they're presented. When the study concludes, let me know what happened. I was part of it, and let me know, but in my language. Don't make me dig for it. If I have to dig for it, I end up in a journal that I have to pay $32 to access the right to read it even just once, or figure out the way to email the main author so the author gives me permission to read it. That's just too hard to do. So yeah, so treat me like a person and treat me a little bit special, because I am doing a special job.
Wonderful, thank you. So we've talked a bit sprinkled throughout in terms of achieving the state that Cindy just described. With respect to the application of technology, and at AWS, as we work with customers, there are a lot of customers that really want to transform the clinical trial experience and the elements contained within. And we really focus on how do we lend efficiency to that process, and how do we work with customers to shorten the duration of the recruitment process, the identification of an appropriate cohort, developing a protocol, and really condensing that time frame from an efficiency standpoint, and then ultimately working with customers to unlock the data. What can you learn from the data? How can it be applied elsewhere, et cetera? So there were a number of references to technology. Perhaps there are some comments that could be made where that fits in, where you think the innovative elements are. And Craig, I know you mentioned that it's really out there. It's a matter of identifying where certain things fit. But what's been the approach in terms of the application of technology to help move this forward?
Well, I do think that there is a technology story that sits beneath everything we've been discussing here. When we're thinking about patient insights from the beginning, we can capture patient insights in a lot of different ways, whether that means convening groups of individuals, working with advocacy, running surveys, engaging with online communities. There's a number of different channels for patient input and insights. But in our study design and planning process, we've always consumed lots of different types of data: epidemiologic, competitive intelligence, performance data on investigators. What we're starting to see is the emergence of different platforms that help drug development designers bring that data together and support decision support. And we have to start to think about those patient insights as another vital data stream that too often is landing in people's inboxes and relying on individuals to have to grab this bit of data and that bit of data and try to merge all of this together. But instead, what we're starting to see are protocol designing tools that can treat all of these different types of insights together and help provide a holistic view of what type of design will make the most sense. That spirit certainly pulls all of its way through, Todd, just as you were pointing to, whether it's how we're planning and designing, some of the back-end efficiencies, some of the patient experience interventions we were speaking about, and ultimately data flow, but making sure that our data flow doesn't end with just the deliverables that we want, right? We think as drug developers in terms of deliverables for our studies, deliverables for our leadership to make decisions, deliverables in terms of publications, deliverables to regulators. But we also have to make sure that our tech platform cycles back to our participants. As Cindy was mentioning earlier, what are the deliverables that the research participants need at the end of the study that they deserve? Study results and information in patient-friendly language that's accessible to them, their own personal data that was collected on them during the study to help them understand where did they land? Where did they sit on that curve in the paper? Which data point is me? People deserve to know that. And after the study is over, when the blinding is finished, there's no reason that we shouldn't make sure that our data platforms reach all the way to the end of that milestone.
Great, thank you. Other comments in terms of the role, application, opportunities to apply technology to, once again, achieve that optimal patient experience?
I could talk as a patient. I don't know a lot of the things you're talking about from the industry point of view, but me as a patient, a great use of technology would be to help me find that clinical trial. Not in clinicaltrial.gov where it's just way beyond my understanding, but in a tool where I could, with the help of my doctor if I need it, or myself, input all my data. Well, what are my pre-existing conditions? What treatment options have I already had? What are my specific genetics? Anything that is important in making that, inclusion, exclusion criteria of a trial. Put all that information in. Once I get all that information in, then give me a list of trials that are just for me, that I already fit that inclusion exclusion criteria, so I don't have to weed through it. Then give me a drop-down menu. Give me a filter. I want to see trials that are within 100 miles from me. I want to see trials in these states. I want to see trials that use this type of method, mechanism of action. So I can start picking what trials that may apply to me. Many patients don't enroll in trials because they don't think there is one for them, because their doctor never suggested to enroll in a clinical trial. If their doctor never told them, we have this trial, most people don't think that there is a trial. So if you can put that back into the patient's hands, where they could start researching and knowing that there are options out there for them, and some of those options may be better than the standard of care, maybe you'll see enrollment in some of those trials increase.
Terrific.
And, I'd like to add too that, from the feasibility perspective, I think data has become, and has been, but it's become even more the new data sets out there about the feasibility of, some of the clinical trials that are being issued. And, if our clinical trial protocols are being developed in such a way that our inclusion exclusion criteria is so, really kind of narrow on the types of patients that fit that criteria, we're going to have a real problem with enrollment. So being able to access various data sets, real world evidence, and other ways that we can integrate data into really driving our feasibility is really important. I know recently, excuse me, we've also looked at, the data surrounding social determinants of health. And I think that's another, arm of where data is going to be really empowering us as an industry to really make sure that we're placing clinical trials in the appropriate areas, but also really looking at the holistic view of the patient. So what are those other factors that are really having an impact on the patient? And I think it's an amazing time in the data aspect to be able to kind of see, from a data perspective, what's happening and how patients are being impacted by things other than just various types of endpoints, but what are the social limitations, the financial limitations really surrounding the patient.
Todd, I want to emphasize. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Sonali.
I just wanted to add, from what Cindy was saying, to the use of technology to make it easy for patients to find clinical trials. One of the things that we work on is how can we make it easy for primary care providers, or just providers in general, to find a clinical trial for their patients. One thing that we've learned over and over is that it's basically a non-starter to have a provider go into a different application or use a different system to do anything. They don't have the time to do that. So we think a lot about how can we fit that kind of clinical trial understanding and recruitment into their existing workflows via their EMR, and make finding a clinical trial as easy as it is to, for example, send a referral to an outside provider. And so the way that we think about technology is not so much, is there some new application they could use, but are there ways to use what they're using right now to make it easy for them to do things like find clinical trials for their patients in a way that fits within their existing workflow.
What Sonali just described is the missing link. It is the magic in this process, because what you heard from Cynthia a moment ago is I need help finding study opportunities, but our current model relies on serendipity. The only way that I as a patient am going to find a trial in reality, if I want to learn about studies from my physician, which is what most patients tell us is their preference, the only way I'm going to hear about it from my physician in most cases is if I happen to be a patient of a provider who happens to be an investigator in the trial and happens to think about the study when we're having our encounter together. That is a ridiculous amount of serendipity. But the patients we're looking for research are not medical mysteries. These are people who have a diagnosis. In most cases, they have a prescription and they have a doctor in their life. When you look at survey data from places like Healthgrades, the average physician rating in this country is a 4.4 out of 5. People like their doctors, but we don't have success yet with platforms that engage treating physicians to create opportunities for them to have conversations with their patients if they're not investigators in studies. And so when Sonali talks about examples like engaging with community health centers and stakeholders that are not a part of our clinical trial ecosystem, I want to sort of call that out because everybody's ears should be lighting up around that as being, I think, our grand challenge, and solutions that can engage that treating physician are going to become, I think, the holy grails for us.
And
Great.
what I was thinking, and it's just gone through my mind, so I haven't really thought it out totally, but in the era of COVID-19, we relied a lot now on our community oncologists, our community physicians to carry out clinical trial procedures, testing, visits. That used to be done by the investigator because patients could not go into New York City or the big cities. And I don't know the data because I'm not in the back end, but I think it turned out pretty well. I think that, you know, that relationship between the investigator and the community doctor working together on a trial, you know, works. You know, why do I need to have my vital signs taken 100 miles away when I could go like down the street to have my doctor take it? I think if you work, continue that model, that more community doctors, community oncologists, local doctors may start thinking about suggesting a clinical trial to one of their patients, because if they do, that patient isn't going to leave their practice and go somewhere else. They could work together, you know, hand in hand, so you're not kind of losing that patient or giving the patient to someone that you might not want to do, like if you're working hand in hand. I don't know if that makes sense, and it didn't come out quite the way I wanted it to, but use those learnings that we've had about engaging your local doctors in clinical research, and then I think everyone will be happy, including patients who don't want to travel.
Perfect. And I think that was exceptionally well said. So for thinking of it off the top of your head, very nice job. I did want to let the audience know, if you do have any questions, feel free to populate them in the questions box. I know due to the robust nature of the conversation, the time always goes by very quickly, but we would have an opportunity to answer a few questions if there are any. If we could perhaps just go around the panel really quickly, and if you had a wish for the future, the one change that you'd like to see, what would that be?
So it's silent. It's that awkward silence, and usually that leads to all four of us speaking at once. Todd, my magic wand wish is going to pick up actually on something that Madeline hinted at, which is optionality. And our future state is not about forcing people to go to the clinic, and it's not about forcing people to stay home to participate, but it's the really hard part, which is how do we give people choice and how they participate? And if there's one thing all of us have learned in the year 2020, it's how we value our ability to have choice in how we engage. We've all been exposed to seeing a doctor online, but it doesn't mean we don't want to go back to the clinic. We've all been living with takeout and home delivery, but we would like to get back to a restaurant. And that doesn't mean protocols that tell us that January and March, you will stay home. In February and April, you will go to the clinic. Because if Whole Foods did that and told me which months I have to stay home or go into the market, I wouldn't call it very customer centric. It's really hard. So I think that has to be a stretch goal that all of us that are aspiring to bring flexibility for participation are aspiring toward.
Excellent. Thank you, Craig.
Oh, go ahead, Cindy.
I just, as a patient, want something that makes finding what I want easy. When I go shopping, I could go on to Amazon, I could put just a couple words, and all of a sudden I get a list. And if that's not quite what I want, I get, you may also like this and this, and customers who search this also search this. So now all of a sudden, even though I wasn't quite sure what it is that I wanted, I found exactly what I wanted because I had suggestions that I didn't have to do. I want that with clinical trials. I want to put one word in, some kind of search engine that will pop up searches and then say, and you may also consider this, and people who search this also looked at that. Why can't we do that?
Great. Thank you, Cindy.
Yeah, I think my wish is just that I really hope that this commitment to an interest in diversity in clinical trials is something that sticks, that becomes more and more serious. It's not just a passing thing or something that feels kind of expedient right now. I mean, I think everyone knows how important it is. And so we're starting to see, I think, more oomph being put behind that and actual like real dollars and money and engagement and teams of people, very smart people putting time and effort. So I'd like to see that continue and expand.
Great. Thank you.
And I guess if I had my magic wand, I would say that there would be an option for all medical providers based on the EMRs of their patient, and everybody's got some kind of EMR system that, you know, a trial match would automatically pop up. And it would be an offering as one of, like, kind of going through a patient's medical history. When you see them, it would be one of the options that you ask them if they would be interested in, and whether or not they would at least have the option, because I think a lot of patients, and this is in the diversity aspect too, just aren't made aware that options are even available for them.
I just
Great.
wanted
Thank
to
you.
add, I'm fortunate that when I go see my myeloma specialist from the very, very first time, at the end, I was always given options. Besides the treatment I'm currently on, if that treatment begins to stop working, I could do this, I could do that, but always in those options, there was always, I could explore this trial. So it wasn't something that if I relapsed and someone talked about the trial, I was thinking I was going to be dying because I'm now having to consider a trial. It was something my doctor said from the very beginning. My doctor always gave me options of things I could try and told me the risks and benefits of each of them. And then it was my decision as to which way to go. And I know that's not always happening, but I do like that idea of options and having clinical trials as always one of your options.
Great. One quick question that I wanted to get to, and I know we're at the top of the hour, but a real important question came in, and I'll blend these questions together. And it's dealing with socioeconomically disadvantaged populations that may not have an HCP or may not have readily available access to technology. How might we solve for that? That's
Yeah.
an easy fix.
Yeah, that's obviously a really difficult one. I mean, one of the things that's been there's been some really interesting research that came out in the last couple of years about the best ways to reach patients and the ways to reach patients that actually result in the most patients enrolling in a trial. And in terms of that percentage of what's the way to reach out to patients that actually yields results, the best thing has been actually community groups, like church groups, community organizations, which are often something that's kind of like, oh, you know, if we have the time or effort, or if we have someone who's from a particular community, fine, but not important. But I think that as an approach should be emphasized and built upon. Again, it's all about that relationship of trust. So I think it's important to include that in overall recruitment tactics.
Yeah, and I would just say not to underestimate the power of partnerships, partnering with your local community advocates, and really trying to utilize those channels, like Sonali said.
I agree with Sonali. I'm on a committee at the Cancer Institute of New Jersey who are trying to get the populations of New Jersey in their clinical trials. And a lot of people on that committee are diverse church groups, different community groups, places where maybe that population of people spend most of their time. So you go to places where they are and you work with those trusted resources and then see how that education can come up through them. So, yeah.
And we may be very excited about using technology in our studies and letting people use their own smartphone or their own smartwatch if that's their preference, but we should never set ourselves up to leave people behind if they don't have access. And provisioning technology has been something we've done for years in clinical trials, and we should make sure that that's always baked in as an option for those who either don't have or don't want to use their own.
Great. Well, I know we're out of time, and I know we could talk about this for a very long time, but I first of all would love to thank our panelists. Thank you for sharing your honest and direct perspectives on a very important topic. Would like to thank everybody that participated in the session today. We always appreciate that. And I thought what I would leave you with is there's just something that stuck with me, and there are a number of key takeaways. But Cindy had mentioned that as a patient and defining this experience, know me. And as we think about putting patients at the center, getting medications to patients who need them more quickly and safely, know me. And I think that's a very good concept to end on. So thanks again, everyone, for your participation today. And we will be talking soon.
Thanks
Thank you.
all.
Thanks.